For over 34 months, Russia has been at war with Ukraine, and today we want to review the military situation there. I'm Julian Repke, and this is BILD Situation Room. And we start in the southeastern Ukrainian city of Zaporizhzhia. There are still 700,000 people living there, and this city was once again hit by massive Russian airstrikes yesterday. Airstrikes that struck the heart of the city and tragically resulted in the deaths of at least 13 individuals. We are observing the footage here from a surveillance camera of a vehicle, or rather, specifically from a dash cam of a car. And we can already see here how people, the mothers with their children, start to run at the first impacts. Now we also see there at the first impact of a bomb in a factory, and now here a massive explosion directly on the street. And this explosion, unfortunately, once again, hit civilians, completely innocent civilians who were on trams, who were on buses, just going about their day, on their way to work, and they were tragically killed or seriously injured by this Russian bomb. We have a total of 13 dead and up to 130 injured, according to various reports. President Zelensky has firmly denounced and condemned this heinous Russian terrorist attack. And now we are also seeing what the apparent objective of this attack was. It's the Modosich plant, an engine factory, an engine plant here in Zaporizhzhia city. We see here an administrative building of this plant, which was hit and also caught fire after the attack. Nonetheless, we also see a lot of destroyed cars in this location. We notice a tram that has definitely been impacted by the attack as well. And we just saw very severe injuries among the people who were simply out and about, either on their way to work or here, as we see in these small buses, were on the move. The deceased still lying in the buses and streetcars later in the evening. The wounded were cared for as well as possible by the authorities there. And once again, it's shocking footage that shows us that Russia, with its glide bombs, which are actually relatively precise but still not entirely, also targeting city centers, knowing full well that these bombs, of course, fall within a radius of 500 meters to the left and right of the intended target. Based on the footage we've observed, we can say that approximately 2 of the bombs accurately struck the factory. There's debate about whether that's a valid war target. Certainly not of an illegitimate war. However, at least one of the bombs landed just in front of the factory, directly on the street, and tragically killed all the civilians who happened to be passing by at that time. Let's take a quick look at Zaporizhzhia on the map, a city not often mentioned, unlike the Zaporizhzhia region, which is also 75% occupied by Russian invaders. We see the region here in the south of the country, and Zaporizhzhia extends roughly in this area. And we see that a large part of it is under Russian control, marked in red here. But the city of Zaporizhzhia, with its 700,000 inhabitants, is still north of it, about 30 kilometers north of the front. In that sense, it becomes relatively easy for Russian fighter jets, such as the Su-34, to drop their glide bombs from a distance of approximately 40 or 50 kilometers away, which then proceed to fly into the center of the city. Like what sadly happened again yesterday. From southeast Ukraine, we proceed towards western Russia, clearly marked on the map, specifically heading to the Kursk area. Recently, conflicts there have risen sharply. We've observed notable advances by the Ukrainian army. However, it now appears that this was more of a reaction to a massive Russian offensive in the region, carried out by the Russian army from various units and intended to serve that purpose, to reclaim this region before Donald Trump assumed office, ensuring it cannot be exchanged or altered in any way. We're looking at footage of the Ukrainian army that was released today, in this case the 47th Mechanized Brigades, and here we can observe another significant Russian assault executed by a substantial number of armored vehicles that occurred in this region in the northwest part of the front line. They tried to approach it here, namely Malaya Loknya. We also see that numerous infantrymen were deployed. We will soon be able to observe that the Ukrainian units have extensively utilized their drones, specifically their kamikaze drones, and according to their own reports, they managed to kill about 40 Russian soldiers on this day. 53 injured and more than 10 Russian army vehicles were successfully neutralized. We see the footage once again. The whole thing is, of course, in good weather, and that seems to be the case here, with few clouds, very challenging for the Russian army to hide the whole thing. And we can see the conditions here right now. So those are large fields, hard to hide between the trees. The Russians keep trying, of course, by attempting to get the infantry into those clusters of trees. Nevertheless, the situation is very difficult for the Russians. As we see here, they are always transported closer by armored vehicles. Then they disembark and the vehicles try to withdraw. And the information from the Ukrainians is that due to these conditions, on the one hand, relatively good weather conditions, and on the other hand, the ground conditions, now we can also see quite well the sun is shining behind it, which means you can achieve or cause a lot with these kamikaze drones here. As a result, the Russian soldiers find themselves in great danger here, or rather, they must secure and firmly hold the terrain they are attempting to gain ground on. We remember back in August it was about 1,200 square kilometers that the Ukrainian army held in western Russia. Currently, it's only about 400 square kilometers. That means about two-thirds or up to two-thirds have already been lost to the Russians. But nevertheless, they keep trying to advance. The Russians and the Ukrainian army is trying to stop it all. We currently have footage from another unit which has also successfully repelled this attack. And we see these are comparable vehicles, and from Ukrainian sources we know, and this is also a criticism of Ukrainian soldiers towards their leadership, that the different units of the various brigades who have these FPV kamikaze drones in Kursk, that they are poorly coordinated with each other. That means if a surveillance drone sees the Russians coming, it might be, according to a quote from a Ukrainian soldier on site, that up to 10 Ukrainian units each launch their FPV drones to intercept the Russians there. On one hand, that's good because we know that these kamikaze drones often fail. That means when I was personally there, nearly half made it through and reached the target. On the other hand, it's obviously bad because if you've directed the kamikaze drone somewhere and the tank explodes or just got hit, then it's tough to choose a new target considering the drone's battery only lasts about 10 to 15 minutes, so you need to deploy it by then. Even so, we can clearly see another Russian assault was effectively thwarted in Kursk. However, we also have new footage that shows us these same conditions. On the one hand, the long, vast fields where you can see far and spot the opponent well, and on the other hand, the good weather of the past days have led to this. That the Russian army, in this case the Chechen unit Akhmat, also relatively effectively thwarted a Ukrainian attack in the region with their kamikaze drones. Here we see the sun again, we see the blue sky, and we can see that the Russians are able to move relatively freely with their drones, indicating that the electronic warfare is only partially effective for the Ukrainians. It always depends on the frequency used, and we can see here that a whole range of Ukrainian vehicles, again, we're also talking about Kursk, so also Russia, that these vehicles from their Akhmat units from Chechnya in the Russian army were hit and partially destroyed here. Here we also see that the Russians are now able to attack at night. This means we have thermal imaging being deployed, and the kamikaze drones are able to attack Ukrainian units both during the day and at night. Before we take a look at the map, let's take another moment to examine the small town of Makhnovka. Makhnovka, a small place merely 2 kilometers southeast of Sucha, the only town that Ukraine continues to control in this area. And we have new footage from there showing it's fluctuating, indicating it's not clear-cut that the Russian army is advancing further. In the past few days, she's already said that she's almost reached Sucha. But we have footage here that shows us that now the Ukrainian soldiers, here we see them marked, moving again towards the southern end of Makhnovka, so they drove the Russians out of the place, which, as mentioned, is only 2 kilometers southeast of Sucha. In other words, it's a back and forth. The Russians had already reported capturing the location. However, they seemingly did not have enough soldiers to maintain control, so the Ukrainian ground units returned accordingly and proceeded to follow the main road along the main street. We see it clearly, that's the main road south. Following this main road, here we see it in the thermal view and there in the normal view. This village is back under their control. We'll examine that on the map shortly. It certainly indicates that it's a back and forth struggle, and you can't clearly state that the Russians are making decisive advancements here. They do that in some places, but in other places it's also the Ukrainian army that's gaining new territory in Kursk and bringing new villages under their control. And one of those particular villages that we have not yet witnessed coming under Ukrainian control is Pogrebki, and there we have very recent footage, specifically recordings from a Russian fiber optic controlled drone. That's why these recordings are very good. You can clearly see which street, which house, and all the surrounding details. That's why it's also relatively easy to pinpoint the location. And these recordings show us that the Ukrainian army has quite obviously now managed to bring at least this house in the northern part of Pogrebki under their own control. It's really unsettling, disturbingly precise footage, one must say. It almost looks like someone is moving across the street, as if someone is wearing a GoPro, but that's actually a fiber optic controlled kamikaze drone moving through the Ukrainian-held village and now flying extremely precisely into this house. Now we see another perspective of it. The drone moves forward towards the house, and here we witness the explosion. But what it also demonstrates to us, as previously mentioned, is just how precise and with remarkably very good quality the Russian kamikaze drones are able to advance. But it also clearly indicates, as just mentioned, that Pogrebki is no longer under Russian control. Instead, this small settlement located north of Malaya Lochnia is currently under Ukrainian control. Here we see it. This is Pogrebki, the location we just viewed in the previous footage, and based on the Russian material and its very good quality, that's, so to speak, the side effect that the Russians definitely didn't want. We can confidently say that the Ukrainian army currently holds Pogrebki. The footage we saw earlier was from Makhnovka, and this small place, as mentioned, is right by Sucha. We saw there that the Ukrainian army has come back. We had seen the Russian footage showing attacks on Ukrainian vehicles. That was here in the direction of Berdin, not indicated on the map here, but at Bolshoy Soldatskoye. And we had, not least, the massive Russian attacks that were carried out in this direction here, which then also was repelled by the Ukrainian army. In other words, we see it all around this small area, still about 400 square kilometers, held by Ukraine. There's a hard fight going on, and it's not just, as we hopefully have seen, not just the Russian army advancing, but also the Ukrainians trying to hold on at least until Donald Trump's inauguration, at least until the 20th of January. From the western part of Russia, we return again to the southeast region of Ukraine. The Russian army completely occupied the city of Kurakhove a few days ago. And it's quite interesting, the Ukrainian military leadership said, we had to withdraw from Kurakhove because all the buildings there were destroyed by the Russians and because there are no more defensive options. A statement likely seen in the broader context of the ongoing war as we observe current footage of the Ukrainian army clearly. Bombing houses, industrial facilities, and various other important structures here. In Kurakhove, these are recordings from Kurakhove, from the city that was lost. In this case, not from the part where the 18,000 people lived, but where they worked. We see various industrial facilities being attacked by the Ukrainian army, and this totally puts into perspective the statement that there would be no more hiding places here, or that the defensive options would no longer be available. We see that the Ukrainian army, due to its numerical inferiority and due to the encirclement of Kurakhove, the drones, we remember, in the north and south, the Russian army has already moved past Kurakhove. From the east it has pushed, and that's why they withdrew from the city. Advanced toward the west, leaving the city, which then ended up under Russian control as they moved on. We can see here, these are also relatively large buildings. These are indeed 4 or 5 story buildings that still stand here. And these are large residential buildings as well. These structures are still standing and continue to offer the Russians essential shelter. Despite lacking crucial essentials such as gas, water, or electricity, they provide significant protection, allowing for strategic positioning to defend the area effectively. Here we again see it at the very end. This is the Kurakhove Reservoir, the large and expansive dam situated to the north of the city. This is one of the dams that stretch across the city, and here is one of the significant main roads. Here we see large industrial facilities in Kurakhove itself, which are now under Russian control. And here we see the impact of a Ukrainian bomb, again in the hope, yes, in a split screen, once in thermal view, once in the normal view, in the hope of hitting Russian soldiers there, who have probably been settling here in the city by the hundreds. To launch an attack there and hinder any further advancement toward the west. From the Donetsk region in southeastern Ukraine, we move to the Kharkiv region in northeastern Ukraine. There too, Russian units are trying to advance, although, and it's always important to emphasize, this region has not been annexed by Putin. Nevertheless, even in that area, the Russian army is advancing forward. They are attempting to move toward the city of Kupyansk, located on the Oskil River. And here, we have footage of Battalion Achilles, the 92nd Brigade of the Ukrainian army, attempting to use night drones equipped with thermal vision to target the Russians at a specific time of day, or rather, to catch the nighttime when they do not really expect to be threatened. We are aware that many Ukrainian drones still do not have thermal vision. So the Russians are speculating on this and sometimes use relatively light vehicles. We just saw Ural trucks. We saw small off-road vehicles moving with these vehicles, of course, at night to approach the Ukrainian lines, or maybe just for logistics, to aid the front troops. We can always see this well here. The Achilles battalion regularly shows which vehicles are involved. I hope, however, that it is recognizable. This, for instance, is a Ural truck currently here from the drone units of the 92nd. Brigade was destroyed. We examine the map closely and notice that Kupyansk continues to remain under Ukrainian control. That much can be said. However, we also see that it's becoming increasingly critical for the city itself, as the Russians, as always, apply their flanking strategy here. Creating pincers formation, Kupyansk sits on both sides of the Oskil River. You can see it a bit, I hope. It's visible here. So here it goes, through the region. Also to the east of that, that's Kharkiv. To the west of it is naturally also Kharkiv. And we see the Russian attacks once again on Kupyansk itself. They are still relatively well intercepted by the Ukrainian army. We can see that there's an attempt to move from the south along the eastern axis towards the north, heading towards Kupyansk. And we can see here, it's a bit hard to discern, but the Russians have crossed the Ostgil there, and the entire southern part of Dvorizhna is now also marked in orange here. This indicates a war zone where the fighting is occurring on what is technically the Ukrainian side of the river. And this is, of course, a huge threat for the Ukrainians, because if the Russians manage to completely capture Dvorizhna, they could advance south on the Ukrainian riverside, and then Kupyansk would be encircled. That is clearly the Russian goal in the region, and that is, of course, what the Ukrainians are trying to prevent. Let's proceed further south in the country to thoroughly examine the airspace in that specific area. And this airspace is still partially controlled by the Russian army. We saw it earlier. In Zaporizhzhia, the Russian Su-34s can drop their glide bombs relatively undisturbed, even on large cities 30 kilometers behind the front. But there are also drones of the Russian army of the Lancet type that move relatively freely there, although not as risk-free as the bombs. Because these drones are now being shot down repeatedly, intercepted by the Ukrainian Air Force or various Ukrainian brigades that effectively act as an air force. And here we can see one of these brigades expertly taking aim with an FPV drone at a Lancet drone that belongs to the Russian army. We see this Lancet is quite modern. It's simply the best. You could say, though it's still a prototype, it can fly around 70 kilometers. However, that can be controlled very precisely right up to the end, can fly into their target, which can even move. And we see one of these Lancets flying over the snowy landscapes of southeastern Ukraine, but then it is hit by an FPV kamikaze drone of the Ukrainian army, which has been modified so that it no longer targets ground objectives but can attack air targets instead. And precisely we see here until the last moment it flies in. The video naturally concludes at that particular moment as the explosive mechanism of the drone originating from Ukraine is activated, resulting in it bringing the aircraft down in a crash. There are also clips showing these Lancets on the ground, however, relatively few because most of these drones are intercepted before they reach Ukrainian targets and therefore crash in the occupied territory. That means the whole thing is always a bit of a tricky situation for Ukraine because, of course, the brigades have to show that they've managed to shoot them down. However, we can prove we shot them down. Unlike ground targets, there isn't a Mavic drone or similar nearby to have another look. How the attack takes place, but in the moment when the signal is lost, the FPV drone, the Ukrainians must assume that they've at least touched it, the hostile drone, and hopefully at least the Ukrainians' assessment that then both have crashed. Finally, let's look at a military exercise by the Ukrainian army, likely happening in the western part of the country. And this exercise, once again shows that Ukraine is, of course, not militarily at the end, even with so few soldiers at the front. We have repeatedly addressed the issue of manpower. Naturally, Ukraine has far fewer soldiers than the Russian army directly at the front. But that doesn't mean it's the end. The Ukrainian army is constantly forming new brigades. Just this year, several brigades have been established, several tens. So last year, in 2024, several 10,000 men were called to arms. However, they are not immediately sent to the front. Instead, they first train here with various military vehicles delivered from the west to learn how to effectively fight together as a brigade. Because basic training alone is not enough for the soldier, these 6 weeks abroad or in Ukraine, to immediately fight together accordingly. We now see different vehicles here. On one side, first of all, mine-protected vehicles of the Cougar type from US stocks were delivered, and on the other hand, AMX-10 RC armored vehicles of French or French-made origin. And we also see some of them being displayed here in a sequence. This means they are now practicing the march or preparing for an exercise, a combat exercise. We can definitely see that there are additional Ukrainian brigades being trained that are not yet at the front. The question that arises, of course, is how good their quality truly is and whether Ukraine is even prepared to be deployed at the front. when you still have to prepare, or at least there's the possibility that, for example, a new Russian attack on Kiev could happen from Belarus, or that the Russian army, this had been feared for several months already, that they might cross the Dnieper River in the southern area and then proceed with an advance directly into central Ukraine coming from the Kherson region. These are at least significant concerns that undoubtedly need to be taken very seriously by the Ukrainian General Staff, and this is one of the reasons, among many other factors, why we do not see all Ukrainian military units defending the country through combat in the south and east.